Hi, I'm Sarah Ledbetter, and I play basketball here at Miami-Dade. Um, and today I'm going to be reading about Rosa Parks. When 1 o'clock p.m. came and the lunch hour ended, Mrs. Parks went back to her work as a seamstress. Gray would write in his civil rights memoir, Bus Ride to Justice. I continued my work and left the office in early afternoon for an out-of-town engagement. Shortly after 5 p.m., Rosa Parks clocked out of work and walked the block to Court Square to wait for her bus to go home. It had been a hard day, and her body ached from her feet swollen, from the constant standing on her shoulders, throbbing from the strain in her chronic bursitis. But the bus stand was packed, so Parks declined to jockey for a rush hour seat, crossed Dexter Avenue to do a little shopping, at least cut-rate drug. She had decided to treat herself to a heating pad, but found out that they were too pricey. Instead, she bought some Christmas gifts along with aspirin, toothpaste, and a few other sundries and headed back to the bus stop, wondering how her husband's day has been at the Maxwell Air Force Base barbershop and thinking about what her mother would cook for dinner. It was in this late day reverie that Rosa Parks dropped her dime in the box and boarded the yellow olive city bus. She took an aisle seat in the racially neutral middle section behind the movable sign which read colored. She was not expecting any problems as there were several empty spaces at the whites-only front of the bus. A black man was sitting next to her on her right and staring out the window. Across the aisle sat two black women deep in conversation. At the next two stops, enough white passengers got on and nearly filled up the front section. At the third stop, in front of the Empire Theater, a famous shrine to country music fans as the stage where the legendary Hank Williams got his start, the last front seats were taken, with one man left standing. The bus driver twisted around and locked his eyes on Rosa Parks. Her heart almost stopped when she saw it was James F. Blake, the bully who had put her off his bus about 12 years earlier. She didn't know his name, but since the incident in 1943, she had never boarded a bus that Blake was driving. This day, however, she had stepped in. "Move, y'all, I want those two seats." The driver barked in behalf of Jim Crow, which dictated that all four blacks in the row of the middle section would have to surrender their seats to accommodate the single white man, as no colored could be allowed to sit parallel with them. A stony silence fell over the bus as nobody moved. "Y'all better make it light on yourselves and let them have those seats," Blake sputtered, more impatiently than ever. Quietly and in unison, the black women sitting across from Parks rose and moved to the back. Her seatmate quickly followed, and she swung her legs to the side to let him out. Then Parks slid over to the window and gazed out the Empire Theater marquee promoting A Man Alone, a new Western starring Ray Milland. The next 10 seconds seemed like an eternity to Rosa Parks. As Blake made his way toward her, all she could think about were her four bears who, as Maya Angelou would put it, took to the lash and branding iron and untold humiliations while only praying that their children will someday flesh out the dream of equality. But unlike the poet, it was not Africa in the days of the slave trade that Parks was thinking about. It was racist Alabama in here and now. She shuddered with her memory of her grandfather back in Pine Level keeping watch for the KKK every night with a loaded shotgun in his lap echoing John Brown's extermination. Talk, talk, talk. That didn't free the slaves. What is needed in action? Action. So when Parks looked up at Blake, his hard, thoughtless skull filled her with pity. She felt fearless, bold, and serene. "Are you going to stand up?" the driver demanded. Rosa Parks looked straight at him and said no. Flustered and not quite sure what to do, Blake retorted, "Well, I'm going to have you arrested," and Parks, still sitting next to the window, replied softly, "You may do so." Her majestic use of may rather than can put Parks on the high ground, establishing her as a protester, not a victim. "When I made that decision," Parks stated later, "I knew I had the strength of my ancestors with me, and obviously their dignity as well." And her formal, dignified no, uttered on a super time bus in the cradle of confidentiality, as darkness fell, ignited the collective no of black history in America, a defiance is liberated of John Brown's on the gallows in Harper's Ferry. The situation put Blake in a bind. This would, of course, have to be evicted from this bus. But should he do it himself or should he call the police? Would it be better if he just take her name and address and report her to the authorities later? Uncertain of what to do, he radioed his supervisor. "I see it," said, as how I got up and swore and then went and called the police and told them to come get her. Blake told Washington Post reporter Paul Hendricks in 1989, after years of remaining silent about the incident. "Well, I called the company first, just like I was supposed to do. Nobody ever wrote that. I got my supervisor on the line. He said, 'Did you warn her, Jim?' I said, 'I warned her,' and he said, 'I remembered it just like I'm standing there.' 'Well then, Jim, you do it. You got to exercise your powers and put her off here,' and that's what I did. Within minutes, Montgomery police officers FB Day and D.W. Mixon arrived and listened to Blake's account of what he had transpired. Parks just watched as the three white men conferred on her fate and realized what it would be. She would be fingerprinted and put in jail. The other passengers, black and white alike, began getting off the bus quietly but nervously, some with self-possession to ask for transfers, others too anxious in the violated situation. The blacks who remained on the bus sat in stunned, silent recognition that this time the authorities had picked the wrong woman to mess with. It was like a musky inside. One passenger recalled, "You could have heard a pin drop. It's as if we were all praying to Allah." The two policemen then boarded the bus, less than thrilled at the prospect of arresting a prim, well-mannered, middle-aged woman on charges of violating the segregation code. When Officer Day asked Parks why she had refused to stand, she replied with a question that had no more answer. "Why do you all push us around?" Day responded with a shrug, and the only justification he could muster, "I don't know, but it's the law and you're under arrest." Then he picked up Parks' purse. Mixon gathered her shopping bags together. They escorted her to the squad car. They did not handcuff Parks or mistreat her in a way. In fact, Parks saw them as two tired, beat cops with no desire to waste their time and effort writing a report for minor offense. At the point, Parks was only in police custody, not officially arrested, but that a warrant would have to be sworn out and signed at City Hall. On the way there, Officer Day, more curious and angry again, asked Parks, "Why didn't you stand up when the driver spoke to you?" This time, she had nothing. Calm head descended upon her. Parks had unstraightened herself to the Lord's hands. Just about everyone who hears the story of Rosa Parks asks the same question. Was her refusal to give up her seat premeditated? Did she invent to become the NAACP's test case against segregation? The answer to both is no. Rosa Parks did not wake up on the morning of December 1st, 1995, primed for a showdown over civil rights with the local police. A lifetime's education in justice, from her grandfather's nightly vigils to the murder of Emmett Till, had strengthened her resolve to act when the time came. What arose with Parks that fateful evening was belief in what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. often said, that some of us must bear the burden of trying to save the soul of America. On her way home that night, Parks had no intention of making the headlines or story. She was thinking about relaxing for a rare moment, propping her feet up on the sofa, listening to a couple of Christmas carols, and preparing for the evening's NAACP Youth Council meeting. But when a white man tried to use an unfair system to undetermine her dignity, Rosa Parks realized that it was her burden to stay put. Just having paid for a seat and riding for only a couple blocks and then having to stand up was too much, she told the Highlander Folk Schools Executive Committee at the meeting a few months later. These other persons had got on the bus after I did. It meant that I didn't have the right to do anything but get on the bus, give them my fare, and then be pushed wherever they wanted me. There had to be a stopping place, and this seemed to have been the place for me to stop being pushed around and to find out human rights, if I had any. By the time her arrest was processed at Montgomery City Hall, Rosa Parks' spirit had hardened. She knew the police were wrong, and she had sat in the colored section, that she obeyed the rules. Apart from the ordeal, she eyed a water fountain, and Officer Day gave her permission to take a drink. But Officer Mixon quickly stepped in. "No, you cannot drink no water," he shouted. "It's for whites only." You have to wait till you get to jail. It was the only time that Parks grew any anger during her arrest. A grown man, a law enforcement officer no less, presumably a Christian, was denying a tired, middle-aged woman a sip of water. She couldn't help but think of Roman soldiers who had given Jesus only vinegar to drink on the road to Calvary. Parks filled out the required forms and asked if she could make a telephone call and let her husband know where she was. Her request was denied. As the policeman escorted her from City Hall to their squad car, she remembered chuckling to herself. Who would have thought that little Rosa McCauley, whose friends teased her for being such a goody two-shoes in her dingy white gloves, would ever become a convicted criminal, much less as subversive worthy of police apprehension in the eyes of the state of Alabama. The city jail on North Ripley Street was calm when Rosa Parks arrived, ready to accept her fate, whether a tongue lashing, a beating, or even worse. After all, it had not been that long ago that a black man had been shot to death just for demanding his fare back when he got off a bus he had decided was too crowded to ride. Parks' fears were overblown, but her jail experience was hardly pleasant. She was fingerprinted and her mugshots taken. Her handbag was confiscated, and once again, she was denied a drink of water. After she was processed, a female guard led Parks up a flight of stairs to the iron barrel cells on the second floor. A rank order permitted the corridor, which was silent but for the clang of keys, the sound of their footfalls, and the racking cough of sickling fellow prisoners. The guard put Parks in a dank, musty cell by herself and walked away. Within seconds, she returned, offering Parks the option of a larger cell with 2 other women. By this time, indifferent to her accommodations, Parks chose the latter and once again asked to make a telephone call. Again, her request was denied. Parks recounts her beliefs straight in jail in my story, a straightforward narrative that makes a valuable companion piece to Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience and King's letter from Birmingham City Jail. She describes how one of her cellmates gave her some water from a tin cup and started talking. The woman had been incarcerated for almost 2 months for having defended herself by waving a hatchet at her boyfriend when he started beating her. As a result, the judicial system had her under lock and key with no way out. Since her boyfriend obviously was not about to come to her rescue, prevented from phoning her brother by the dictates in the police and unable to make bail herself, she was a poor black woman alone in the world and facing a future as grim as her present. Here in the cellmates lently of who's made Parks realize how fortunate she was to have a husband like Raymond who would stick with her through thick and thin. But despite the differences in their situations, a bond was forgot between the 2 women as they talked about double burden of being black female in the 1950s America. The woman scribbled her brother's telephone number on a scrap of paper and gave it to Parks, who promised to call him if and when she gets out. After another hour or so, Parks was allowed to telephone home. Her mother answered. "I'm in jail." Her daughter started matter-of-factly, "See if Parks will come down and get me out." Raymond Parks was on the line in a flash to make sure his wife was okay. She reassured him that the police were cardinal and that she had not been beaten. "I'll be there in a few minutes," he told her, but she knew it would be longer than that, as they didn't own a car. "My husband was very upset," Parks recalled. "My mother was too. After they found out that I was okay, that I hadn't been physically manhandled, they felt better." Word of Rosa Parks' arrest had already spread through Montgomery's black community. Another passenger on the bus that would go down in history had told Parks' friend, Bertha Butler, about the showdown with Blake. Butler had immediately contacted Edie Nixon's wife, Arlette, with the shocking news that angelic Rosa Parks had been arrested. Arlette Nixon left a message for her husband at his office downtown, then placed around their Clinton Avenue home wondering what to do. She was relieved when she finally rang back asking, "What's up?" "You won't believe it," Arlette Nixon replied. "The police got Rosa. She's in jail, but nobody knows the extent of charges or whatever if she's been beaten. You better get her out." All Nixon could manage response was, "Holy Mother of God." He called the police stations to find out what charges were, and they wouldn't talk with me because I was black. He remembered. They couldn't have been ruder, so Nixon decided to seek the help of his friend Clifford Durr, a white lawyer the police would have cooperated with. I asked Clifford if he would call the jail and find out why in the hell they arrested Rosa Parks. Nixon recalled Durr did immediately, especially outraged that a friend was being denied her civil liberties. The officer he talked to told Durr that Rosa Parks had been looked for violating the city segregation ordinance. With bail set at $100, their paying white clients having abandoned them, the Durrs were broke. So Nixon offered to post Parks' bond himself, but even so, he asked her to come to the jail with him with fear that corrupt police would try to take his money without releasing Parks. The Durrs found themselves heading to the city jail and eating Nixon's blue Plymouth to bail out their friend, all discussing the possibilities of making this NAACP's Jim Crow's test case. They all agreed that the moment of action had arrived. I waited for them while they made bail, Virginia Durr wrote later in Outside of the Magic Circle. Everything went very smoothly. They brought Mrs. Parks out behind the bars. That was a terrible sight to see, this gentle, lovely, sweet woman whom I knew was found of being brought down by magic. She wasn't in handcuffs, but they had to unlock 2 or 3 doors that greeted loudly. What impressed Virginia Durr was how tranquil Rosa Parks remained the epitome of grace under pressure. As Nixon signed bond papers, Raymond Parks came in close to tears. He gave his wife a bear hug that swept her off her feet as her 2-hour ordeal came to an end. The Durrs hopped in Nixon's Plymouth, and the trio followed Raymond Parks, driving a car hastily borrowed from a low friend back to Cleveland courts. There they had a powwow over coffee to take a stock of what had happened. Nixon refrained from discussing legal strategy straight off, sensing that Rosa Parks wanted to return normally, to change her clothes, eat dinner, and run her regular Thurs to change our date to NAACP's Youth Council meeting at the tiny Trinity Lutheran Church across the street. When Nixon accompanied her to the church, however, he used their time alone to lobby his friends to let her arrest become a civil rights test case, taking care to push too hard and to give Parks time to assess her options. This was not easy, for from the moment he has first heard A. Philip Randolph speak of civil rights in St. Louis, E.D. Nixon had been itching for a direct confrontation with Mr. Charlie, as he called the white power establishment. He couldn't help but to see as a gift from God that Mr. Charlie had been fool enough to arrest Rosa Parks, but to his consternation, he censored reluctant on the part of his intended heroine. Nixon arrested an interview that he had prod Parks into taking a public stand, strongly disagreed by Virginia Foster Durr. Mr. Nixon remembers her as being extremely reluctant due to it. But I remember it was her husband who was reluctant, Durr recalled. He kept saying over and over again, "Rosa, the white folks will kill you. Rosa, the white folks will kill you." It was like a background chorus to her to hear the poor man who was as white as he could be himself, for a black man saying, "Rosa, the white folks will kill you." I don't remember her being reluctant. But Rosa Parks would not be rushed into a decision. She had to consider the potential impact of filing a lawsuit on her husband and mother, both whom were against the prospect of Rosa becoming a public spectacle. For one thing, she was family's principal breadwinner, and coming the NAACP poster woman for desegregation was bound to get her fired from her job at Montgomery Fair. What's more, Parks' husband, the mother, had been warning her for years of working with E.D. Nixon and NAACP would get her lynched from the tallest telephone pole in town someday. It was one thing to be arrested for an isolated incident, but quite another, as history and Taylor Branch would put in partying in the waters, greener than forbidden zone by choice. Rosa Parks already knew, of course, that a court case would turn into even more an outcast in white Montgomery. Although unconcerned about her own physical safety, she also knew that any public position she took would cause dire trouble for her husband. The police would harass him, perhaps even frame him on some trumped-up charge. Her mother's health, meanwhile, was frail. Could she endure a long, drawn-out trial? Rosa Parks fretted over these dilemmas, but in her heart, she never doubted what she had to do. As compelling as she found the Highlander School's teachings on Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence, as attractive as those methods were proving to a growing number of black activists, including Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks' own philosophy came closer to the views of playwright Lauren Hasbury. Negroes must concern themselves with every single means of struggle, legal, illegal, passive, active, violent, and nonviolent. They must harass, debate, petition, sit in, sing hymns, and shoot from their windows when racist comes cruising through their communities. As a Christian, Parks stands in defense of herself, and her fellow blacks would always be tempted by mercy, even toward her tormentors. Indeed, she believed in the righteousness of turning one's cheek once or twice, but she also believed that the oppressed eventually had to fight back. As she saw it in the Holocaust, should have taught everyone in the facility a valiant evil with passive resistance alone. In revealing 1967 interview of Howard University, she said, "Kennedy, I don't believe in gradualism or that whatever is used to be done for the better should take forever to do. Unaware now, little need he had to beat around the bush. E.D. Nixon finally came to a point. Mrs. Parks, he said, with your permission, we can break down segregation on the buses with your case." Replying with remarks, composure, Rosa Parks confirmed that she would challenge the constitutionality of ordinance under which she had been arrested to Nixon's jubilation, and thus did an ordinary civic-minded woman give birth to modern civil rights movement. Still brainstorming in the Parks living room, as 9 p.m. approached, the Durs, Nixon, and Rosa Parks turned to the practical questions involved in what they had planning. Who would finance the lawsuit? Now, if you're going to fight, this is on a constitutional basis, you will have to get the NAACPs to finance it because it's going to cost you a fortune. Clifford Durr told Parks, "It would have to go a long way with the Supreme Court of the United States, and it's going to cost a lot of money." It didn't help matters that Montgomery NAACP's coffers were essentially bare, and that even the organization's state chapter lacked the financial resources to support a costly and possibly protracted legal battle. It was at the point, late in the evening, that Clifford Durr mentioned an NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund headed by Thurgood Marshall, who would win 29 of the 32 major cases argued of the NAACP and eventually be appointed as the U.S. Supreme Court in 1967. Fred Gray had close ties to Marshall's group, which Clifford was confident and would take case eagerly once they became acquainted with Parks' sterling character. By 11 p.m., a strategy was in place. Rosa Parks, with Gray serving as her attorney, would challenge Montgomery's bus segregation ordinance on constitutional grounds, supported if necessary by the NAACP Legal Defense of Educational Fund. Clifford Durr would work with the national media and offer counsel as needed behind the scenes. He could not act as Parks' lawyer of record without forcing his brother-in-law, Justice Hugo Black, to rescue himself in the case of avoid conflict interest charges. The Cleveland Courts Summit continued the tradition of the rebels who gathered in Philadelphia in 1776 to renew King George III's design to reduce them under absolute despotism. In December 1955, it was in the far more humble setting of Rosa and Raymond Parks' influenced Florida living room that a group of Americans with less than $500 among them banded together to stand up for the principle of democracy by taking on the greatest failing the United States version in his 1965 book, Who Speaks for the Negro? Author Robert Penn Warren reflected on why the Parks arrested was such a watershed movement. An event is never single and isolated, he decided. It is not bright until gleaming before the eye of God. It's a complex of various factors, and it's hard to know about accident comes in. It is hard to know where necessity comes in. One thing Warren knew from certain, however, America was never the same after that fateful day. Parks herself had no easy answer to the questions of why the exact transformation movement. I was determined to achieve a total freedom that our history lessons taught us we were entitled to do, no matter what the sacrifice. She recalled, when I declined to give up my seat, it was not that day or bus in particular. I wanted to be free like everyone else. I did not want to be continually humiliated over something I had no control over, the color of my skin.
Good morning. I'm Lisa Crane. I'm with the Miami-Dade College South Campus Art Department. I'm a student here. And I'm going to be reading from Martin Luther King's speech, I have been to the mountaintop. Something is happening in Memphis. Something is happening in our world. And you know, if I were standing at the beginning of time, with the possibility of taking a kind of general and panoramic view of the whole of human history up till now, and the Almighty said to me, "Martin Luther King, what age would you like to live in?" I would take my mental flight by Egypt, and I would watch God's children in their magnificent trek from the dark dungeons of Egypt through, or rather across, the Red Sea, through the wilderness, on toward the Promised Land. And in spite of its magnificence, I wouldn't stop there. I would move on by Greece and take my mind to Mount Olympus, and I would see Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Euripides, and Aristophanes assembled around the Parthenon. And I would watch them around the Parthenon as they discussed the great and eternal issues of reality. But I would not stop there. I would go on even to the great heyday of the Roman Empire, and I would see developments around there through various emperors and leaders, but I would not stop there. I would even come up to the day of the Renaissance and get a quick picture of all that the Renaissance did for the cultural and aesthetic life of man. But I wouldn't stop there. I would even go by the way that the man for whom I am named had his habitat, and I would watch Martin Luther as he tacked his 95 Theses on the door at the Church of Wittenberg. But I wouldn't stop there. I would come on up even to 1863 and watch a vacillating president by the name of Abraham Lincoln finally come to the conclusion that he had to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. But I wouldn't stop there. I would even come up to the early 30s and see a man grappling with the problems of bankruptcy of this nation. And I would come with an eloquent cry, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." But I wouldn't stop there. Strangely enough, I would come to the Almighty and say, "If you would allow me to live just a few years in the second half of the 20th century, I will be happy." Now that's a strange statement to make because the world is all messed up. The nation is sick. Trouble is in the land. Confusion all around. That's a strange statement. But I know somehow that only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. And I see God working in this period of the 20th century in a way that men, in some strange way, are responding. Something is happening in our world. The masses of people are rising up. And wherever they are assembled today, whether they are in Johannesburg, South Africa, Nairobi, Kenya, Accra, Ghana, New York City, Atlanta, Georgia, Jackson, Mississippi, or Memphis, Tennessee, the cry is always the same. We want to be free. And another reason that I'm happy to live in this period is that we have been forced to a point where we are going to have to grapple with the problems that men have been trying to grapple with through history. But the demands didn't force them to do it. Survival demands that we grapple with them. Men for years now have been talking about war and peace. But now, no longer can they just talk about it. It is no longer a choice between violence and nonviolence. It is a choice of nonviolence or non-existence. That is where we are today. Now, What does all this mean in this great period of history? It means that we've got to stay together. We've got to stay together and maintain unity. Now we're going to march again. And we've got to march again in order to put the issue where it is supposed to be. And force everybody to see that there are 1,300 of God's children here suffering and sometimes going hungry, going through dark and dreary nights, wondering how this thing is going to turn out. That's the issue. And we've got to say to the nation, we know how it's coming out. For when people get caught up with that which is right and they are willing to sacrifice for it, there is no stopping point short of victory. We aren't going to let any mace stop us. We are masters in our nonviolent movement in disarming police forces. They don't know what to do. I've seen them so often. I remember in Birmingham, Alabama, when we were in that majestic struggle there, we would move out of the 16th Street Baptist Church day after day. By the hundreds, we would move out. And Bull Connor would tell them to send the dogs forth, and they did come. But we just went before the dogs singing, "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around." Bull Connor next would say, "Turn the fire hoses on." And as I said to you the other night, Bull Connor didn't know history. He knew a kind of physics that somehow didn't relate to the trans physics that we knew about. And that was the fact that there was a certain kind of fire that no water could put out. And we went before the fire hoses. We had known water. If we were Baptist or some other denominations, we had been immersed. If we were Methodist and some others, we had been sprinkled, but we knew water. That couldn't stop us. And we just went on before the dogs, and we would look at them, and we'd go on before the water hoses, and we would look at it. And we'd just go on singing, "Over my head, I see freedom in the air." And then we would be thrown in the paddy wagons, and sometimes we were stacked in there like sardines in a can. And they would throw us in, and old Bull would say, "Take them off." And they did. And we would just go in the paddy wagon singing, "We shall overcome." And every now and then we'd get in jail, and we'd see the jailers looking through the windows, being moved by our prayers and being moved by our words and our songs. And there was a power there which Bull Connor couldn't adjust to. And so we ended up transforming Bull into a steer, and we won our struggle in Birmingham. Now we've got to go to Memphis just like that. I call upon you to be with us when we go out on Monday. Now, about injunctions. We have an injunction, and we're going into court tomorrow morning to fight this illegal, unconstitutional injunction. All we say to America is, be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they hadn't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of the press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for right. And so just as I say, we aren't going to let dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. We are going on. I left Atlanta this morning, and as we got started on that plane, there were 6 of us. The pilot said over the public address system, "We are sorry for the delay, but we have Dr. Martin Luther King on the plane, and to be sure that all of the bags were checked, and to be sure that nothing would be wrong on the plane, we had to check out everything very carefully. We've had the plane protected and guarded all night. And then I got to Memphis, and some began to say the threats, or talk about the threats that were out. What would happen to me from some of our sick white brothers? Well, I don't know what's going to happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter to me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to have a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will, and He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. Thank you.